Hey, everybody, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. I was sitting back enjoying the music. Don't you worry about a thing is now stuck in my head probably for the rest of the day. Um, so, we're going to move on to our next session. I'm going to be joined by two panelists. One is Seyed Khorashahi, who's the Executive Vice President of Medical Devices and Chief Technical Officer at Regulatory Compliance Associates. And then we're going to move in Denise Baker, who is the Senior Director of Global Regulatory Research at AstraZeneca. So we're going to be talking about quality metrics. Again, the title is Quality Metrics Essential to Quality. It's one of those things that have been in our industry for almost a decade now. You remember when I was at the agency, we first put those out. Um, the reason why, I think, from the agency perspective, two different things. Some were using metrics, some weren't. And a lot of people that needed to be using metrics weren't. So they wanted to get the awareness out. I think they definitely got the awareness out. Um, Multiple conferences, you can see Denise smiling because she's lived through it all. So is Syed. Um, but then you have to kind of pull back a little bit, and now they are reinvigorating it. So I think we're going to kick it off. Denise is going to give a short presentation, and then we'll kick it off with Q&A. And as we were saying earlier today, please give us your questions, comments, and we'll be sure to address them. Thank you very much. Denise Syed, welcome. And Denise, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm very happy to be here. And yes, I am smiling about this topic because I have been involved from that very first Federal Register notice in February of 2013 through till now with a number of conferences and responses to comments, and really trying to listen, partner with the FDA and with the industry side and understand how do we move forward and improve. I like what you said, that there was a need for more people to use metrics who hadn't been using metrics. And I think that is something FDA really did push for and has been relatively successful. So in my slides, what I just wanted to do is sort of level set where we are today and maybe generate some food for thought for the comments and the questions we have. So the foundation of all of this work really goes back to Janet Woodcock's famous quote in 2004, this vision of efficient, agile, flexible pharmaceutical manufacturing sector, high quality drug product without that extensive regulatory oversight. And I think she's worked very hard to try and shrink that footprint of regulatory oversight by asking industry to become more mature and to take on more responsibility for their own culture. And metrics is one, and quality, and metrics has been one outcome of that. So back in 2013, FDA did publish this one quality voice sort of state of the pharmaceutical quality. And there were a number of things that they identified as challenges. And this was provided as one of the reasons for moving in the direction of metrics. And if you read through this list, unfortunately, here we are, as you said, almost 10 years later, a lot of these things are unfortunately still with us, right? We're still having a high level of recalls, and we still have shortages going on. We've perhaps made some progress moving in the direction of Q12 with post-approval supplements, but it's not really fully implemented yet. We still have a pretty burdensome framework. Things are perhaps not as risk-based as they could be. FDA, I believe, has made probably the most progress in terms of how much information they have, that with the different kinds of data they're gathering and the structures they're putting in place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. They know a little bit more than they did back in 2013. So what's really happened is this evolution. And I think, Syed, this kind of came out in one of your sessions earlier today, talking about quality systems, that we have started with this rules-based oversight, where it was based on legal evidence and inspections and very compliance-focused. So you're either NAI, VAI, or OAI. And we're evolving to this newer paradigm where it is more based on your systems and your risk management and your culture, be that safety culture, environment culture, more predictive analytics and big data. Are you using some of those tools that are available to you in Q8, Q9, Q10, and now Q12? So more of a systems, metrics, and analytics-based approach. And you've probably seen, I just have a very small size there. FDA has this umbrella called quality management maturity with a number of things underneath. So they see a lot of different parts and pieces coming together to make up this overall idea of maturity, and metrics is certainly an important piece of that. This gives you a brief history over time from that first Federal Register notice forward. I did not put all of the conferences and industry white papers. This was really the FDA specific steps. So several publications, a lot of collaboration with their site visit program and metrics feedback. So it took 5 years even to get to that point from that first Federal Register notice. And then more recently, in 2020, when they did the third-party QMM assessment, and now this spring in April, there's been an additional QMM has started to appear in their publications and in their communications more directly. But specifically for this talk, and we're going to talk a little bit more about QMM tomorrow afternoon, but right now we're going to focus on this Federal Register docket that came out in March, which was the revision to the metrics reporting program. So this slide attempts to capture the evolution of the specific metrics that have been mentioned. So in response to that initial docket back in 2013, PDA wrote a white paper and made some recommendations. If you've been around, you remember, but that original question that FDA asked industry very almost innocently is, give us an idea of what metrics you use in your business today. Just give us a list. So in PDA's response, these were the sorts of things that they identified as being reasonable metrics. Lot acceptance rejects rate, complaint rates, OOS, in PPK and CPK, CAPA effectiveness, and this idea that you really needed quality culture, a focus on solid quality culture underlying your metrics. And over time, you can see there's been a little bit of back and forth. Some publications, the Brookings meeting was an FDA industry meeting hosted by the Brookings Institute. Then FDA published a draft guidance, ISPE. Their pilot focused very specifically on just those 3 metrics in addition to culture. There was a draft guidance that was a little more limited focus, and then the St. Gallen report. In the feedback program in 2018, that really broadened FDA's view. They saw a number of different metrics in operation during that program. And you can see then how that led into the last column here represents of these original metrics that had been talked about over time, how many of those are still in the current publication that came out this spring. So you can see a number of those are still there, and then there's actually 11 additional metrics. So just kind of a visual way to see how the categories have evolved. The new metrics document, I like to call it a choose your own adventure. So they've identified 4 categories or 4 practice areas in which they would like companies to select 1 or more metrics. So they've been pretty clear in communicating these are the areas we're concerned about. It's manufacturing performance, pharmaceutical quality system effectiveness, which of course ties back to Q12, laboratory performance, and supply chain robustness. So the supply chain piece, of course, really tries to go after the drug shortages problem. FDA has been pretty insistent over time that there is something in this category of laboratory performance. They especially want to have some metrics when they go into a site that maybe only does analytical methods. And of course, all of the data coming out of those labs and analytical methods are really important to the decisions you're going to make about your products. So the metrics in blue, light blue, are the ones that were on the previous slide. So those have been talked about over a number of years. And the ones in black are suggested by FDA in this document. And you'll see those are not really new. Many of you are probably already using those in your own manufacturing sites. But it's the first time that FDA put them into their documentation, so to speak. It's also probably important to point out, if you haven't seen FDA's presentation on this, they do give grace and a little bit of leeway as to what exactly you might select in each of those categories. FDA is continuing to do additional metrics research. So University of St. Gallen is out of Sweden. They have an operational excellence research center with quite a large database on pharmaceutical industry. There's been a 3-year collaboration so far. It's extended now, so it's going to be more than 3 years. But St. Gallen produced 2 different reports on metrics for FDA. They actually expanded their data set looking at laboratory performance, again, in conjunction with FDA's focus on wanting to understand laboratories. And then they have a new contract that has begun in fiscal year 2022, which is to build an analysis tool or an analysis framework that looks at the culture data, the metrics data, the existing external reports, FARs, BPTR, PATERs, all of those things coming in, and to come up with sort of a compliance score and an excellence score. So that'll be interesting to see how that comes out. But it's showing, I think, that FDA is still trying to evolve their approach and how they look at metrics and what they do with them. And maybe just a word of caution or thought-provoking, and we can chat a bit about this if you're interested, is so far, CDER is really leading the way. They have been the driver pushing behind all of this. There are some differences already in how the Center of Biologics looks at quality systems. The BLA structure requires more information on your process and on your operations than just the limited GMP nature that comes with an NDA. But so far, we haven't heard them really focus specifically on metrics or maturity. In CDRH, we had quite a nice breakout session earlier that did a good job of explaining some of the differences in the CDRH approach, which is much more systematic, more focused ISO 9001 approach. And they also did a pilot looking specifically at maturity, using this capability maturity model integration. I think that comes from Carnegie Mellon, if I'm remembering that correctly. As far as other health authorities outside of the US, they seem to be waiting and watching to see where FDA goes. If you talk to them individually, you'll hear them say, well, we're keeping an eye on it. But due to the pandemic, there has been a greater international collaboration. The ICMRA, International Coalitions of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, has been very active in sharing information, and health authorities working together to move quickly to review COVID-related therapeutics, as well as cooperate on inspections and other things. So perhaps that increased collaboration may spill over into the metric space and give FDA an opportunity to share some more of their learnings and their concepts there. So I'll stop there, just enough to kind of get us started, and go back to Steve, and we can look at some questions.
Thanks, Denise. There we go. So, Seyed, I'm going to kick it off with you for a question. Before I get this, I'm going to give it one more plug. If you got a question, please pop it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Good. But Seyed, from the device perspective, Denise just covered a lot with the drugs. What do you see from the device perspective from people, especially for the people who weren't able to get onto the device breakout session? Are there other metrics you see there on the device side that should be included? What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think Denise touched on the voluntary improvement program from CDRH, right? The VIP program. So before I talk about that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of my background, because she also touched upon the CMMI 2.0 and then how FDA has adopted that as a part of assessment. My background, I've worked in the medical device industry since the 80s, and my background is software engineering. So software as a discipline is both art and science. And I think measurements and metrics is something that I have been very passionate about, and we have been involved. So when we talk about software, and by the way, that's why FDA emphasizes software more than hardware, and software is a little bit different because it really does need that discipline, because it's part art, part science. And then if you're not able to measure, you cannot improve. If you're not able to measure, you cannot manage. You can't predict quality, etc. Software is pretty simple, and it has basically 3 constructs. Either it's a sequence, it's a condition, or it's a loop. And it's interesting when you look at back in the 60s when there were big operating systems like the IBM 360 being developed by thousands of people. It was pretty tough to manage the quality of software and the number of bugs, etc. So people started studying, and simple concepts as lines of code metrics, for example, it was shown empirically how that could predict the quality of the software. As software got more complex, it had more lines of code. And then people started, basically differentiating between the sequence lines of code versus conditions and loops, et cetera, et cetera. So when we talk about CMM, I came across CMM probably early in the 90s. CMM was basically a Department of Defense funded activity. And when Watts Humphrey joined Carnegie Mellon back in the 80s, he started working on it. And then the first incarnation was CMM. Later, the CMMI came in, which is the integration portion of that. And it was purely a software assessment. In those days, I think back in early 2000s, I was with a company that we actually brought in outside folks to do the assessment. It used to be called Scampi, and we worked, towards becoming a basically category for CMMI. So I think not long ago, back a few years ago, FDA, as Denise alluded to, looked at some of the things that some of these companies that were actually doing okay or fine with the inspections, etc., still had some issues and problems out in the field. And then the question was, what can we do to improve that process? And that's why they started the VIP voluntary pilot program. And then last year it became basically that pilot program was completed, and now they have a VIP program that for the people who want to participate in it, there are obviously a bunch of advantages, because one of the things that FDA is looking at is this whole concept of a risk-based approach. So if you are a part of this voluntary improvement program with CDRH, then there are some basically opportunities for risk-based inspections, so that you get basically inspected less based on that risk. And then, if you're doing well in their independent assessments, which there is an institution, the CMM, that does that. And also there are some benefits in terms of submission, especially for the PMA and HDEs. So definitely CDRH with the case for quality has done and does have programs in this area, but it's a voluntary program. And at the end of the day, when we talk about, metrics, and then there's a coined phrase nowadays, measure what matters, that, like on the device side, it's all about, at the end of the day, the customer is the patient. So patient safety is at the forefront of this. Then, and on the device side, design controls is the big part of what we do, and design robustness is an area that we definitely need to measure. Then once we get past that, it's, the process reliability during manufacturing, and the cost of failure as we move forward, etc. So there are definitely commonalities between what area CBER is basically encouraging people to do their metric reporting, and what the device side. But the device side, there's a lot of emphasis on the front end, which is the design robustness. So I'm going to stop there. I took a long-winded answer to your simple question.
No problem. Thank you, Seyed. So Denise, again, thank you for kicking us off. I'm going to start with you with this next question. And Seyed, you touched on it. I'm going to flip it over to you after Denise. So how do we integrate quality metrics with risk-based decision-making to basically optimize operations? How do you guys think of that? Denise, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Fantastic question, Steve. That idea of a risk-based approach is so important to all quality systems. And if you look towards Q12 and the opportunities, that's one of the things in order to have an effective PQS, it needs to be risk-based. You need to be agile to accommodate things changing as they come along. And you have to be able to align your resources to the highest risk opportunities. And I think that's where metrics comes in, is it can help you measure and find where those most critical points are and how stable things are or how variable things are. And one of the things to consider when you're putting together your risk-based approach is those areas of your process or particular product types that may be higher risk, higher variability. You want to make sure you're focused in your quality system on providing enough support and structure there.
Good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Seyed.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And it's just the same for on the device side. It's interesting when we talk about risk-based and measuring what matters is that if I go back to my experience back in the early 2000s, there were offshore companies that they were level 5, which is basically optimized CMMI level companies, but they had learned basically how to be assessed and be good, but it wasn't about the risk-based approach and knowing what matters and then measuring the right things. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the patient safety and it's about the customer and improving the health of the patients and then the methods to measure that and be able to improve upon. So it's not about the metrics themselves, but it's about what can you do to improve healthcare.
Well said. Yeah, we got a couple questions from the audience. Seyed, I'll kick it off with you. So this comes from Paul. He says, can you suggest a good approach to determining which metrics are key to measuring a QMS effectiveness or QMS's effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're looking at on the device side, I think there was a case for quality, there was the pilot study, etc. I think what they looked at was very simple division of the different areas. Pre-production, which is the product realization, basically design and manufacturing, and production, which is manufacturing, and post-production, basically assessment, post-market, how you collect, analyze, and what sorts of things you take. Because at the end of the day, it's all about being able to do measurements where you can calibrate it within the product line, across the product line, aggregating it, etc. Because it's interesting, if you look, I've worked in different companies where the way that they basically looked at complaints and reported complaints, etc., the thresholds were different. So if you purely look at the number of basically reported complaints, it really may not be apple to apple comparisons, etc., from that perspective. So I think within the company, having that calibration of the exact definition and then making sure that it's across product line is going to be measured properly is the key. But those are the three areas: the pre-production, production, and post-production. And it's all about, like in pre-production or design, it's about, okay, I designed a system. From now, how many changes I've made, what the impact of those changes are. In the production, basically, it's about, Denise touched on this, doing it right the first time sort of stuff. How many times did I have to go back and, address the problem that I thought I solved, etc. And then in post-production, it's about the PMS. It's about, the number of complaints, the rate of complaints coming in, the nature of those, whether those are reportable or not.
Cool. Thank you. Denise, I'll hand it to you.
Yes, I'll jump in. I agree very much, Seyed, with what you said. I think on the pharma side, a great place to start is with the elements of Q10 and the different pieces of a quality system that it lays out for you. And do you have some metrics that can help you understand where you are? And perhaps even more specifically focusing on your change control systems. If you look at PICS, they have a guidance about PQS effectiveness, and it's very much focused on how you manage your change controls. So how many changes are you creating? How are they closed? How, are they closed on time? Perhaps even more important than timeliness is effectiveness. Do you have a measure of the effectiveness of your change controls? Do you have a measure maybe of repeat deviations and how many of those are linked to your change controls? That's a way to look at your effectiveness. Another metric that some people really, really like and others have a lot of concerns over, is a little more sophisticated, is your CPK and PPK. So your process capability. I think some people see that as an overall effectiveness of your process. Now that's a little bit broader than just your quality system, right? It takes into account the nature of the complexity of your process itself. Depending on how big your operation is, number of lots, you'll have more or less data points. So it's one to be cautious with, but some people find that to be a very effective metric, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. That's good answers. Got another question from the audience, and this comes from Sonia. Thank you, Sonia. So quality culture. It's on the list of the FDA metrics for CEDAR. It says, my question is, how do you specifically measure quality culture? And Denise, I'll start with you.
Yes, happy to jump into that. We have numbers of people have worked on this question for a few years now. What PDA has shown in our research, and it's been also repeated, the same correlation has been found by the University of St. Gallen, is that culture, which is your behaviors and your attitudes and the values of your employees, can be correlated to the maturity of your quality system attributes. So what the PDA model does, and there is a PDA model for quality culture assessment. You can take training and you can have assessors come through and look at your site. Right now it's set up to be a self-serve model where you get trained and assess yourself. It's not a third-party certification at all. But the idea is the more of these mature system attributes that you have in place, that will correlate with greater quality culture at your site. Now, there are a number of other models, things like the Baldrige Award or the Shingo Prize or the Swedish Institute of Quality, even the ISO approaches, right? You can take those structures, and some of those you can have a third party come out and assess for you and get a sort of a neutral opinion. And there are others that even have prizes. With the Baldrige Award, if you win the Baldrige Prize for your site, then you're obligated to teach the next generation, the next group of people what you did and how you did it. So it's a passive forward kind of thing. So you need to find what works for your site, how many resources you want to spend, whether you want to do it and build your own in-house capability or whether you want to bring someone in to assess you. But it's essentially looking at your systems that then are predictive of your maturity. And that includes not just your GMP systems, right? That includes your safety systems, your environmental systems, your reward and recognition, your employee development. So it's looking broadly at all of those things that support your operations.
Thank you. Seyed, what do you think?
Yeah, no, well said. I think at the end of the day, the quality culture, quality metrics, they're tied at the hip, and it's something that has to be in your DNA. It's not just about measuring, it's about measuring what matters and what, it's all about the improvement in public health. And it's something that this product that I'm working on, could be used on my mom and dad and family. It's something that has to be part of your DNA in terms of, how much quality matters and what the impact is.
Well said. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sonia, for that good question. So next question I have is, the original proposal from FDA regarding quality metrics proposed metrics that were viewed as lagging indicators. To be proactive, wouldn't it be better to use leading indicators? And if that's the case, what are some of the leading indicators that could be useful in identifying potential problems in manufacturing or across our operations? And Seyed, I'll start with you.
That's interesting. I think that's a little bit more related to CBIRD and CEDAR, but I'm just going to address it in a little bit different way. On the device side, basically, we do put a lot of emphasis on design, whether it's designed for manufacturing, it's designed for service, etc. And we deal with all these critical to quality and etc. parameters that we measure. So all of those are things that basically are more predictive as opposed to waiting in the back end, whether we find problems really, which is the worst case, out in the field that we have to address, or we find it during the inspections and audits, etc. So I'm going to hand it off to to Denise to answer the question on the CBER side.
Yeah, that remains to be a challenge, to be more predictive and less lagging. It's obviously easier to count things after they've happened than to look into the future. And that's where your culture can come in. I think listening to your employees and understanding what's happening on the shop floor. So things like Gemba walks, where you can get down and hear about maybe there's a problem or a frustration that someone's having on the floor. And by paying attention to that as an early signal, you can avoid having a real breakdown or something more serious later. Similar, we do it better on the safety side as an industry. We record near misses. Many of us have cultures where people are rewarded for reporting those kinds of things. So trying to build that same idea into your quality side. Can you report quality near misses? Can you encourage people to report problems I've worked with someone and they created a metric that said, at the end of an inspection, when we have the list of observations, we're going to look at how many of those observations had we already flagged internally.
Yep.
So how many can we find our own problems before the investigator finds them? And then we've already got a plan in place. When it shows up on the 483, we can already address that because we've been aware of it.
Well said. Good points. Good points. Yeah, you mentioned by the Gemma walks or the MBWA, the management by walking around, I call it. So I've heard a lot of people call it a lost art form, but I mean, nowadays when I do audits, it's one of the questions I have is how often do you as a leadership team, especially in an opening meeting, I'll ask this, get out and walk the floor together, go through the lab together, go through production or whatever it may be. And I'm usually surprised when it doesn't happen that often. And not unless it's on the other side of the fence when companies get in trouble. Then you see it happening more often. So it's like, how can you do something? And I think that could be even just counting how many times you do it. Did they do it on a weekly basis or a monthly basis or how often, stuff like that. Good points, both of you. Thank you. Nothing else up there. So let's talk about the audit program, something the FDA doesn't get into, of course, but I do believe it is definitely a tool for improvement. So can audit observations be used to determine potential risk? And if so, how might that program work? Side, I'll give it to you first, since Denisha's stuff.
Yeah, no, in my opinion, absolutely. But we just have to keep in mind that audits are based on a small sample size and based on, it's a risk-based approach to look at something and then be able to draw some conclusions. So you're not going to be able to basically find out and, like turn every stone and look under and see what it is. But it's going to be, to tell you the truth, it's interesting. On the device side, as you guys know, FDA is moving towards the ISO 13485 to just go ahead and harmonize it with what they have had. And it's going to be interesting to see, they haven't still come up with how they're going to change their inspection model, because it's going to change a little bit. It's going to be a little bit different. So it's going to be interesting to see how they're going to do it. But at the end of the day, the reason for all these metrics programs and what we have, etc., is to complement the things that we can't find out and have better indicators for knowing how good things are. Because and one of the main drivers is that there are companies that are compliant and still have problems and issues. So there has to be something else. And that's what we're trying to strive for. What can we do to improve upon it? What can we do to measure it and get it to a state where we have less of those?
Okay. Denise?
Yeah, sure. And audits are very important as rehearsals to inspections, right? They keep you on your toes. Everybody gets a little bit nervous and kind of gets ready for those audits. And I think you said it very well, Sahid. It's a snapshot. You're not going to find everything, but you may dig into a few things, because as an internal auditor, you know a little bit more about what the risks are than perhaps someone coming in from the outside. Well, one of the things that we learned in developing the PDA quality culture assessment model is the interactions in an audit are very limited and very specific. And you train your staff to speak to an auditor as if they were speaking to an FDA investigator. Only answer the question that was asked. Don't offer any additional information beyond what it takes to answer the question, very focused. Whereas with the quality culture assessment, you want a lot more transparency and a lot more exchange. And originally, we tried to just tack it onto the end of an audit and have the auditor themselves be the assessor. And we quickly learned that it wasn't the right dynamic, and it didn't get the information you needed because the people responding were still in audit response mode. So the way we train people now is to completely separate that, and then to really get down deep into what's going on in your systems and in your culture. You need to build a trusted environment, and it comes from the leader at the top. Either in general, setting the stage for that culture of speaking up, right? A healthy site is one where the employees feel like they can speak up and raise their hand without fear of retribution. And so building that environment during a quality culture assessment, even if you're having someone come in from the outside, having your leaders say, they are not here to find problems, they're here to help us all improve. So, be honest, let them know what's working, what's not working. And so I think there's audits that are very powerful and may have a place. And they're a great way to generate, like I said, those metrics of what did we find versus what did the inspector from the health authority find. But you need to also go beyond and have that other kind of conversation with your staff to really build a healthy quality culture at your site.
Yeah, just to add a little bit more to what Denise said is, it's interesting. When the pilot for VIP occurred, it sounded like people with the third-party assessors were a lot more open, transparent about the data. And to me, it's interesting to see what happens to FDA inspections once 13485 becomes a required part and FDA is completely aligned. Because one of the things that FDA has is that, hey, you can put your stuff, whatever you want to as part of your management reviews, but I'm not going to look at it because I'm going to let you at least not hide anything from yourself, right? But on the ISO 13485 side, well, that's open. You could look at the management reviews, etc. And management reviews are actually a good place since everything gets discussed and everything, is supposed to be captured in terms of complaints, CAPAs, the trending, all the effectiveness of the system, etc. So it's going to be interesting from my perspective, based on the learnings that they had during the voluntary improvement program that they had with this whole concept of the CMMI and having external third-party assessors and people actually being open and sharing some of the problems, because it was all about what can we do to improve things and what's really going on. Why is it that inside A, I don't have these issues, but inside B, I do have it. And it's just about the tools available, the heat maps, what sorts of issues are, it's just the inconsistency of how you're reporting and how you're doing things that is a part of it. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that develops from that perspective.
That's really interesting. Sorry, Steve, just to jump in. I think on the drug side, we're going to have a real problem with that, because we still have investigators out there that see their entire job is to come in and find the problem. And if they look at this system, it's fine. And this system, they're going to go to the next system until they can dig in and find something. So be there that they make their name that way, or they just really feel like this is how I protect the public health, is I have to keep turning over the rocks until I find the problems, because I know nobody's perfect. That's just a very different attitude, right? Than let's collaborate and work together to improve the system. So you have to, as a site, you have to be prepared for both, right? You want to have that internal dialogue with your folks, but some of those investigators come in and they are not going to be your friend, and they're not going to be out to help you, unfortunately.
No, I agree with you on that one. And it's not the investigator's job to be your friend either. Not to point that out. But you're right. There are different investigators out there for sure. And I think going back to the audit program in of itself, a couple of things that I thought about was, and Denise, you mentioned this in your answers. So I've seen companies where they look at their audit program, and for instance, if a regulator, FDA, non-FDA, whoever it may be, comes in and finds an issue, they find an observation or a deficiency that the audit program already has identified. Well, that's a deficiency for the entire organization. But if they come in and they find something the audit program hasn't found, that's a deficiency for the audit program, because the audit program should have uncovered that. And they use that not from a fear perspective, but from how do we improve our audit program to make sure we find these things. Like I like to think about it as you keep it within the family instead of having the neighbors come over and tell you how to run your house. And then going back to fear, I think, of course, driving fear out, that's one of, Deming's famous 14 points is, remove fear from the organization. Because if people are, afraid of for their job or for whatever reason, they're not going to speak up. And part of a good quality culture, in my opinion, is a speak up organization. So we got time for one last question. And Denise, I'll start with you. So does culture of an organization impact the veracity of the metrics?
Oh, absolutely. 100% does. And that was one of the concerns from some of the PDA experts at the beginning of this program, that if FDA focused only on collecting metrics and collecting numbers, there are ways to game the system, both intentionally and unintentionally. So as soon as you choose to measure something, you're going to change people's behavior. Everyone's human nature is to make it green, to make it, if it's supposed to be high, to make it high, if it's supposed to be low, to make it low. And unless you have that underlying culture that sets the tone for the integrity and, like you said, the veracity of the organization and how those metrics are used, that they're not used to penalize people, you could be reporting numbers to the FDA or another health authority or your upper senior leadership that aren't meaningful, that have been gamed, or have, if the goal is to reduce the number of deviations, then we'll start changing our definition of deviation. If the goal is to close change controls on time, well, we'll close them and then reopen them later. And some of that's intentional, some of that's unintentional, but people's behaviors get a little bit crazy if they don't have that solid support that doing the right thing is what matters, not having green metrics. And it's okay to have the reds and the yellows. That's part of running a business. You need to know. That gets back to the risk management. If you don't have any red metrics, how do you know where your risks are?
Good point. Seyed, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree anymore. I think it's just gaming the systems. I've seen it before, as I said, with CMMI, that there were companies that were level 5, which is optimize the highest level in CMMI model, and they still had problems and issues. So I think, at the end of the day, the key to this whole thing is making sure that, you keep in mind what the purpose of this is, which is improving the health, and it's about the patients.
Well said. Thank you. Time for last comments, last comment. So Denise, ladies first, any closing remarks?
Oh, thank you. Just to say that this is a really interesting area. And I know it can be intimidating if you haven't done a lot of work with metrics, but there are a number of publications and tools that you can search for. So in addition to what FDA has published, PDA has a number of papers, ISPE has done a program with metrics. So if you want to reach out, if you can't find something or you're looking for help, I'd be happy to field some questions offline or try and point you in the right direction. But certainly encourage everybody to jump in.
Seyed.
Yeah, and on the device side, definitely, people should look into the VIP program. It does have some, excellent areas that people can do improvements. Has basically an independent way of appraisals through the CMMI. And, you just have to keep in mind, you got to measure what matters. And it's all about the patient safety. It's about, on the device size, the robustness of your design, and then just making sure that, pre-production, post-production, you're measuring the right things to ensure the risk to the patients. And as FDA has taken that approach of risk-based approach, it's all about that safety and effectiveness of your device.
Thank you both. Denise, Seyed, thank you for your time. Appreciated your comments. Denise, thanks for the short presentation. Appreciate that as well. And thank you very much. And we're going to move on to the next session.